My name is Hamza Azhar Salam and you're watching the Pakistan Daily. Today we're with the President of Azad Jammu and Kashmir, Sardar Masood Khan Saab. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Mr. President, how do you view the recent outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic in India?
Well, it's out of control. The third wave has hit India very badly, and more than 350,000 people are being infected every day. Fatalities are increasing, and this is a cause of concern not just for India, but for all neighboring states, even distant countries. They are worried about this lethal outbreak of the pandemic. So I think that we wish the Indian population well, 1.3 billion people, ordinary citizens who are suffering, particularly those who are being pushed back to the villages and townships. Their suffering is increasing, and that's why Pakistan is making gestures of sympathy and solidarity with the suffering Indian people.
But do you think India's inability to provide basic healthcare to their citizens exposes its dichotomy as a state that actively seeks to become a regional hegemon?
I think that their priorities were not right. They were into jingoism, they were accumulating weapons, they were threatening all their neighbors, and their energies and their attention were consumed by this aggressive agenda. Whereas in the past 1 year, they should have primarily focused on saving their people from the outrage of this pandemic. So I think they are responsible too. I mean, the RSS BJP nexus, they are responsible because in the midst of this pandemic, they were pursuing a fascist agenda, and this was very divisive. And also, like President Trump, I mean, the Hindu ruling elite, they tried to downplay the threat posed by the pandemic. This is one of the factors. I mean, they were saying that probably some of them were saying that by using cow dung, they could treat it also. And so all sorts of these fake treatments were being peddled. So what I want to say is that whatever was the cause, this was one of the causes. The other cause was that India has been hit by very, very virulent mutants. It's not the original strain that hit, let's say, China or the United States or European countries. It's a unique virus, and it is a combination of two mutations, and that's why it is so lethal and it's spreading very fast.
But do you think this outbreak will induce some soul searching in the Indian leadership at this time, and they'll move away from their fascist agenda?
It's up to the people of India to do that. In fact, I mean, I don't think that the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh and the Bharatiya Janata Party, they would revise their agenda. They believe in it. They think that this is their calling, that they would forge ahead with it, not only in India, but also in the immediate neighborhood. So, but it's up to the people, because we know that 1.3 billion, majority of them, are not extremists, are not violent extremists. They want to have decent lives, they want to have a secular state, they want to have a tolerant, pluralist state, and it's up to them to stop this madness which is represented by the RSS and BJP.
So, Mr. President, you've demanded the release of Kashmiri political prisoners in India, including Yasin Malik. So, do you think India will agree to this demand?
Well, India will not agree to this demand. But let me tell you that there are different categories of prisoners that we are talking about. You have these Hurriyat leaders like Yasin Malik, Asiya Andrabi. You also have Shabir Shah, who's been in prison for 35 years. You have others, Musarrat Alam Bhat, you have Ashraf Sahrai. So all these prominent leaders have been incarcerated. You also have Sayyid Ali Gilani and Omar Farooq, who are detained in their own houses. So this is one category. And the number is big. I think that these top leaders are about 174, and they need to be released. The second category is our political activists who were imprisoned after August the 5th, 2019. And there are thousands of these prisoners which are incarcerated, who are incarcerated either in the IOJK or the Indian Occupied Jammu and Kashmir concentration camps, or in the most notorious jails in northern India. And all these, and the bulk of them are youths, as a matter of fact, they're teenagers, even some children, or prisoners in their 20s. And they have been housed in these very cramped prison houses, which are concentration camps. You know, while I'm in these prisoners like Yasin Malik or Asiya Andrabi, they are threatened every day with dire consequences, with execution and all sorts of punishments. But these other detainees, prisoners, they are their lives are at risk because of COVID-19. Because, as I said, they're in cramped prison houses, and there is evidence that in these prison houses there are many victims of COVID-19. So I think, as a humanitarian gesture, India should release them. Otherwise, they would make Kashmir, particularly Kashmir, and these jails that I have referred to, a hotspot of the coronavirus pandemic.
Yes, you're absolutely right. But regardless of India's treatment of Kashmiris or Muslims in general, we've seen a sympathetic response from Pakistan towards India in this time of crisis. We've seen the ED Foundation offer medical assistance. We've seen a hashtag called Pakistan Stands with India during this time. So do you think extending such an olive branch will reduce the animosities between these two neighbors?
The face of Azad Jammu and Kashmir and Pakistan is a humanitarian face. I mean, in this hour of suffering, we've expressed solidarity with the people of India. And we have always condemned the oppression committed by the Indian authorities, successive governments, but we stand with the people of India. That doesn't mean that we absolve the Indian governments or the ruling elites of their crimes against humanity, which they have been committing for the past 73 years in the Indian Occupied Jammu and Kashmir. So we do not want to link these two things, but it's a reality. I mean, they've been brutalizing the people of Jammu and Kashmir. Yes, you're absolutely right. The government of Pakistan has formally offered assistance, humanitarian assistance, to the Indian people to fight this lethal virus. And the AD Foundation, Faisal AD, he has offered humanitarian assistance. He wants to establish a humanitarian corridor to India. Now, I think that this is what we believe in. I mean, communities, South Asian communities should be like that, integrative, caring, and coming to each other's, one another's help when they need it. So I would draw another corollary from this. I would say that if we can do this to India, why can't India establish a humanitarian corridor towards Jammu and Kashmir, the occupied territory, the territory that they have occupied, so that there is humanitarian relief for the Kashmiris also. And the biggest humanitarian relief that they can get is to end that siege that is there, of a siege that has been there for more than 600 days. So I think that while the Indian population is suffering right now because of COVID-19, multiply it by 100, and that is what is the degree of suffering of the people of Jammu and Kashmir.
So what can Pakistan do to improve the conditions of the people in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir?
We're ready to do everything. As a matter of fact, I mean, doctors from Pakistan want to supply medicines, and also there are many people from here, South Kashmir, who want to go across on humanitarian missions. It's not allowed by India. We would also, because they don't trust us. But I think what they can do is that they can open their doors for international humanitarian organizations. You have Oxfam, you have many other famous international organizations, also human rights organizations. They can move into Kashmir and try to provide relief to the people of Jammu and Kashmir. You know, the international humanitarian organizations are very active. I mean, whether it is Yemen or Syria or Libya or Sudan, they rush to those conflict zones. The only exception is Kashmir. India is not allowing any humanitarian corridors into that territory. And the bigger irony is that the international community is also not bothered. I mean, those who care for suffering people, they don't think that the people of Jammu and Kashmir are suffering, or they are not moving at all because of their own experiences and because of their own interests.
So why do you think the international community has ignored the plight of Kashmiris and have not put enough diplomatic pressure on India to implement the UN Security Council's resolution number 47, which calls for a plebiscite in the disputed territory?
Well, I would say that the international community has not been completely oblivious to the suffering of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. You must have noticed that after August the 5th, 2019, they have been quite active. I mean, by they, I mean the international media, some influential parliaments, including the European Parliament, the UK Parliament, the French Parliament, also the United States Congress held hearings, and there are Friends of Kashmir groups in the ASEAN parliaments. Malaysia has been very active. There's been support from the Arab Street in the Gulf and the broader Middle East region. So I don't think that Kashmiris have been deserted. The real reason for frustration is that powerful governments, those governments or those states sitting in the Security Council or as permanent members, or other Western governments, they haven't spoken up because they are signing economic and trade agreements with India. So that is a bigger tragedy of our time. It's in fact, it is because of realpolitik, because of their strategic or economic interests with India that are hampering their action. I mean, in a sense, you're right that these countries that I'm referring to, the Western countries, they're the authors and custodians for modern international law, as a matter of fact. International law is universal and human rights are universal, we know, and they date back to the advent of religions, as a matter of fact. I mean, whether it was Judaism or Christianity or Islam. And Islam has its own charter of human rights. So, I mean, it's nothing new, but, you know, the current phase in which human rights have been codified and humanitarian laws have been codified, the leadership came from the Western countries. And so we are seeing a disorder in the world order. What is happening is that instead of upholding those principles, they have become partial and selective. And they are not focusing on issues like Kashmir because they see lucrative markets in India. So I think that's the barrier that we have to cross. And how do you cross that barrier? I usually, when I'm talking to people here in Pakistan and broad diaspora community, and also human rights activists all around the world, I tell them that we should turn the Kashmir movement into a civil rights movement, a popular movement, and people should show up in squares and streets all around the world so that we can put pressure on parliaments and the United Nations Security Council and these powerful states to respond to the cries of the people of Jammu and Kashmir.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And Mr. President, you've practiced statecraft for most of your life, and you've seen this craft very closely. So do you think the the Kashmir crisis will be resolved in your lifetime?
Well, it is very difficult to predict that. As a matter of fact, I mean, the same question must have been asked in the 1950s. And I don't know what the leaders at that time said. So there can't be a deadline for a freedom movement. There can't be a timeline for a freedom movement. But to make sure that a conflict is resolved, or a dispute is resolved, or an issue like Kashmir is addressed, you have to have peace tables. You have to have diplomacy, active diplomacy, negotiations. Absent negotiations, what you see is conflict, this perpetual confrontation, and also warfare in one form or the other. As far as Kashmir is concerned, there is one-sided warfare, which is imposed by India's occupation forces on unarmed, non-combatant Kashmiris. As a matter of fact, the only tools that they have are their words. Their demonstrations from time to time. They can't even pelt stones like the Palestinians did in the past. So it is very difficult to make a prediction about when the Kashmir issue would be resolved, or whether it would be resolved in my lifetime, or whether it would be resolved quickly. But what I know that we see a turning point in the history of Jammu and Kashmir, because India's war crimes or crimes against humanity have crossed all limits in the occupied territory. And because they've colonized that territory, now they are importing and transplanting these Hindus from all over India and settling them in Kashmir in big numbers. I think that according to one figure, they have already imported more than 3.2 million people in just 6 months last year, and the number is increasing, and they are grabbing Kashmiri's land, and they are eviscerating their rights portal. So we don't know where this whole thing is moving. So I think there's a turning point, and let's hope that the Kashmir issue is resolved as quickly as possible.
But in your opinion, what do you think the exact solution of the Kashmir crisis would entail?
You know, there was a solution that was given by the United Nations Security Council that remains valid and operative. The decisions are there on the table, they have to be implemented. It's the simplest but the most effective solution. What I say is that the people of Jammu and Kashmir have to walk to the ballot boxes and cast their vote. They have to say what they want. It is the decision of the Kashmiri people that gives a solution to this issue. But if there are any other solutions, I have been saying lately that if there are any other solutions in anybody's mind, I mean, good faith facilitators or arbitrators or these third-party countries or forums, then they must consult Kashmiris. It should not be a bilateral dialogue, because it had bilateral dialogue in the past has been a hoax. India has used it cleverly to perpetuate its occupation of the territory. If there is any consultation, then Kashmiris should be associated with that effort, because this is what happened in Afghanistan. I mean, in Afghanistan, Taliban were declared as terrorists, and there were sanctions imposed against them, and there was an active war fought by the Afghan army and by the US and NATO forces against the Taliban, and yet they agreed to bring them to the negotiating table and to have conversation with them that would lead to some sort of resolution of the conflict there. I think a similar thing should happen in regard to Kashmir. Kashmiris should sit around those tables where decisions are made about their future.
Mm. And let's compare the situation in Azad Jammu and Kashmir and in Indian occupied Kashmir. So, Azad Jammu and Kashmir is a quasi sovereign state, if I'm not wrong. Uh, we have a Supreme Court here, there's a parliament, you're the president. So, how is it different from Indian occupied Kashmir? Because they've revoked Article 370, the special status. So, what's the difference between both of these territories?
Uh, right now, the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir has been reduced to a federal territory. It's like a federal capital territory. A territory governed by the capital of the country, Delhi. So it has no autonomy, and its people have been disenfranchised. I mean, they have no say. This Manoj Sinha, who is the lieutenant governor, he's making decisions on their behalf. He's an outsider. So this is the territory. Ladakh and Jammu and Kashmir have been both designated as capital territories. There are no civil liberties there. There are no fundamental freedoms. There are communication blockades there, and outsiders are being settled. Particularly Hindus are being settled so as to change the communal composition, communal demographic composition of the state. And Azad Kashmir is a free state. Azad means free. As you said, that we have two-tier judiciary, we have bicameral legislature, we have president, and we have prime minister. But most importantly, we have fundamental freedoms and civil liberties. There are no political prisoners here in Azad Kashmir. Then we tolerate political dissent also compared to India. I'll give you one instance. I'm in JKLF, Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front, which wants independence of the state. Its leaders are free to broadcast their point of view here in Pakistan and in Azad Kashmir. Whereas on the other side, the party JKLF is banned, and the leader, Yasin Malik, he is in Tihar jail, threatened with all sorts of consequences. So what I want to say is that you can't compare Azad Kashmir and Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Also economically, we've come a long way. I mean, if you go back to 1947, the region that was occupied by Kashmir, the region that was occupied by India, the region of Jammu and Kashmir that was occupied by India, was relatively prosperous and developed, and they had a road network, and they had electricity, and they had good education institutions. But in Azad Kashmir at that time, through a deliberate policy of Maharaja, there was underdevelopment. We had dirt roads, only a few, and we didn't have colleges or universities. But today we have public sector universities, we have medical colleges, we have cadet colleges, we have hundreds of postgraduate colleges, and our educational scene or landscape at the primary and secondary and tertiary levels is very, very dynamic. Also, I think the economic potential of Azad Kashmir is growing very fast in terms of infrastructure, tourism, agriculture, industry, even health sector, education. So we have problems. I don't want to give you the impression that we have resolved all our problems. We have our problems, we have a long way to go, but the most precious thing that we have, the most precious commodity we have on this side of Kashmir is freedom, azadi.
Yes, very interesting. And Mr. President, in the end, would you like to send any message to the people of Azad Jammu and Kashmir, given that elections are just around the corner?
Well, we have to make sure that the electoral process is fair and that there is no interference in the entire mechanism that conducts elections, and that has been the tradition in the past. I think we will follow that precedent once again. The other thing that I want to say is that this is again in contrast with what has happened in India. We are holding elections, free and fair elections in Azad Kashmir. And these elections should be publicized, not only nationally but internationally, so that they know that we believe in elections and we believe in the will of the people of the state. And we hope that such conditions are also created and replicated in the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. And we also hope that India, at least at a minimum, restores pre-August 5, 2019 status of the occupied territory and recognize once again the disputed status of this territory. And before 2019, they used to choreograph this charade of elections. But honestly, most of the people did not participate in those elections. The turnout used to be very, very low. And the Hurriyat party leaders and their followers, they would boycott those elections. So what I'm saying that this election in Azad Kashmir would send a very strong signal that we believe in democratic values, and one of the democratic values that the international community can help us promote is plebiscite. Plebiscite asking the entire population of Jammu and Kashmir to determine their political future.
Thank you very much for your time, Mr. President.
Thank you. It has been a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise.